the way you get the growth going is you enable the private sector. I mean, Sri Lanka's private sector has been stymied at every turn because the public sector is so dominant. And as the public sector contracts, we have to turn to a private sector-led, export-oriented growth. I completely agree we need to grow out of this. So I agree with Jayati on that point. We need growth, and the way to do it is to let the private sector add to productivity. So this is, and so the contraction of the fiscal needs to be also offset by structural measures to help the private sector to grow. The other thing that we need to do is strengthen the independent institutions. There was an example given, the central on the budget responsibility law, but we need to have a stronger institution building. The one thing that Sri Lanka has consistently done is only in the past 16 programs is only deal with the macro part. They have not addressed the structural parts, like strengthening our institutions, which have been eroded for the last 20 years. So, and what kinds of institutions are we talking about? The civil service, the independence of the Auditor General. There are a lot of specific things that I think will come out of this diagnostic review, the governance diagnostic review. And also, as Shanta was saying, civil society needs to step up and figure out what are the institutions that need to be strengthened. So I think this part is also important. The second thing that I think is that we need to help the private sector grow, stop the public sector from regulating every aspect of the economy. I mean, there are price controls everywhere. They help monopoly protected vested interests, basically have the rights to do a few things that we used to be a fairly open economy in the 80s and 90s. But now are much more closed. We restrict imports to not just during the crisis, but in other ways, so that we have essentially enabled corruption through protected markets. And it's a very anti-poor thing to do because it allows room for price gouging in various sectors, which is one example. So more getting out of direct price controls and more regulating things that have truly public externality benefits. So we have to change the nature of the regulation to ones where we are helping public externalities happen, rather than just simply enabling private producers to benefit from a lack of competition. And just to give an example of what I'm talking about, in 1960, exports to GDP ratio was 30%. It fluctuated in 2000, it was 39%. Before COVID, it had fallen precipitously to 23%. That's not it's a gradual decline. And in 2021, it's at 17.7%. Sri Lanka is the size of Mumbai or Mexico City. There's only 22 million people in this country. We cannot possibly grow by protecting our markets. We have to sell to the rest of the world, and we can. Sri Lanka has an extremely strong, educated, skilled labor force, and we can compete on international services. There are a number of things that we can compete on. We are not a low-income country. We have something even now of about $4,000 a year in per capita income. So we need to step up and strengthen the institutions so that we can really become an upper middle class country. I regard this crisis as an opportunity to really fix the underlying problems, which we haven't done for decades. Let me also just touch very briefly on some international aspects of the debt restructuring problems. And just a couple of things. I mean, you can sort of say, why is the IMF central to all of this? That is how the debt restructuring rules of the game are currently set up. You do need a lender of last resort. So the IMF plays that role, and also it is to some extent a neutral arbiter of things like the debt sustainability analysis on which everything is based. So creditors have to come together and they have to have one analysis. And that happens to be the IMF. So it's not just the money, it's the fact that they provide the framework. Now, you might say, why didn't they fix some of these problems before? Well, you know what? The current program and past programs are very similar, and they are not one-size-fits-all programs. They're very tailored to what Sri Lanka needs. The problem is Sri Lanka never implemented those structural changes. Just simply does the macro stuff, gets enough of a break, and then abandons the program. That's exactly what we did in 2019. So we have to kind of be more consistent. And let me just say on the international front. So we need to it takes far too long for debtor countries to have a resolution. Debtor countries need quick resolution. And this is pretty clear. We are destroying value. We're causing hardship it's absurd to have 6.5, 7 months that countries like Suriname, Zambia, ourselves are needing to go through. This is new. It didn't used to be that way. The average time to the board was much shorter. It was about, according to Reuters data, was about 55 days, not the 180 plus days that we're experiencing. And that's because there are new players. And I, worked on Korea during the Korea crisis. And I can tell you that we went to the board within 2 weeks of landing for the first time in Korea. The request, we responded, we as in the IMF, I was at the IMF at the time, responded within a matter of days to the request. So the IMF can move fast if it wants to. It's just that implicitly the international community has decided that they're going to trade off certain considerations like intercreditor equity for speed. So while, the reason we were taking so long is because the IMF has financing assurances as a part of its program. And before it can give a program, the rules say that it needs financing assurances. And it's very difficult to get financing assurances because the creditors don't, they don't want the other creditors to be paid on better terms than them. So here are some of my solutions to this problem. One is, I do think, and I can elaborate, the IMF needs to get rid of the financing assurances roadblock. The IMF should just have a small upfront disbursement, enough so it can react quickly, and then let the debt restructuring itself decide how much more it's going to disperse in other words, backload it a bit, because as Jati correctly pointed out, the size of its resources are not the thing. It's the catalyst effect of it having the program. I also think that it's ridiculous that we can't publish the memorandum of economic policies once a staff level agreement is struck. We can't publish the DSA parameters. This is because the board of the IMF has problems with having the rest of the world know before it apparently sees it. These are easily addressable problems. And I think some of our discussion would be far more educated and informed if we had access to those documents, which are very tailored to Sri Lanka and have specific commitments on state-owned enterprises and corruption, anti-corruption, for example, and so that civil society can hold our leaders to account. The fact that it's secret for so long is a problem, so that can easily be attended to. Then on the comparability of treatment, I said intercreditor equity is a reason why debt restructuring becomes so long. Well, there's a paper by Buchheit and Gulati where they propose to introduce what's called the most favored creditor clause. And we can introduce it. In other words, whoever comes to an agreement with, say, Sri Lanka first, we assure them that any other deal that's struck subsequently is on comparable terms, and if not, we reopen that negotiation. In other words, this is simply very much like a tariff negotiation. So you can make this part of a standard debt restructuring. Now, there's also uncertainty on how much debt relief is needed. This is another thing that gums up the works in terms of having quick debt relief. I would say you need to have contingency clauses. So if growth turns out higher than expected, the creditor will get a bit more. If growth turns out to be lower than expected in the IMF's DSA, which is sort of the central agreed growth path, well, not necessarily always agreed, but the fact is you can have a contingency clause to deal with the uncertainty about growth. So if it's a lower than what the IMF said, then the creditors have to give a bit more restructuring. This would prevent the constant restructuring. I can see that Ravi is signaling to me, so I will end in a couple of, just one more point. We need multilateral mechanisms to ensure trade financing. Part of the economic collapse comes because of trade financing collapsing. And so the recent IFI loan to 3 private banks of 400 million, that boosted some confidence, had some effect. And so that might be a model to work on. So I'm just giving some examples on how the international debt restructuring mechanisms could be improved so that we get much quicker debt restructuring, which is really something that would benefit everybody, creditors and debtors.